Well, for the last 2 weeks, we've been talking about widows. And as I mentioned previously, that obviously this was a major issue in the early church, and explains why Paul spent about as much time talking about widows as he talked about elders in the church and their qualifications. But we may look at that and go, well, how does that relate to us today? And I think part of the way of looking at it is that not only is the idea of people being widowed, both widowers and widows, because the baby boom generation, which comprises about 77 million Americans, is getting into that age bracket where people are passing away. They're getting in their late 60s, 70s, 80s, and part of the reality is that when you're married, that one of you, either the husband or wife, is going to pass away before the other. In fact, statistically, it's the men who are going to die sooner than the ladies, which often leaves the women in a very difficult situation economically. And I know that even in my situation with my wife and I, we're both 73, and we're still in relatively good health, we think. But somebody said we're at that age where we look at everybody else and think we look younger than they do. And in fact, that may be debatable. But the thing I think is really important, and I think is a responsibility that I have as a husband, is that I need to make sure that if I pass away, which statistically is more likely, before my wife, that she is in a position where her lifestyle can be sustained. And that's really, really a concern, I think, because as Paul is pointing out here in Ephesus during this time, there weren't those kind of systems in place. Not only were there not social welfare programs, but even in our own country, those are usually not adequate to support somebody on their own. And more and more we're finding people in my age bracket can't completely retire or stop working. Some of us don't want to. We like what we do and want to keep on doing it. But other people find themselves, basically unable to continue to do the kind of labor and work that they did when they're younger. And this becomes really, really challenging. And so one of the things that I was never advised about when I was younger, but I think that I would certainly give advice to people today, is that make sure that you're making preparations for retirement. You see, I was raised in the context where Jesus is coming back very soon, and we don't have to worry about it because we'll be out of here. And to my disappointment, we're still here. And the reality is I don't know the hour and the day in which he comes. And so in preparation, the possibility that I may pass away and my life would be left as a widow, I want to make sure that she's taken care of and she's provided for. But also I hope that my children would be mindful of her needs and would be helpful in that regard, because it is a difficult thing. As I've talked about before, it's difficult not only financially, but it's also difficult emotionally and even spiritually. And that's why, as Paul, and we have a couple more days, we're going to talk about this issue of widows, because there's so much that he has to say. Paul in verse 14 continues the discussion by saying, I counsel younger widows to marry, to have children, to manage their homes, and to give the enemy no opportunity to slander. Some, in fact, have already turned away from following after Satan. And then he continues in verse 16. It says, if any woman who is a believer has widows, and I like what the NASB does right here. They insert really in hyphens the word dependent. If any believer has dependent widows in her family, she should help them and not let the church be burdened with them, so that the church can help those widows who are really in need. Now, why does he begin by saying if any woman? Well, the simple fact is that in most of Eastern cultures, it's the wife whose family, or the wife who takes in her family, her mother's family, and cares for them in their old age. And so therefore it was kind of her responsibility as the head of her house to make sure that family dependents were taken care of and their needs were ministered to. And so the point Paul makes here, though, is don't let that responsibility fall on the church, but rather let that be something that the family, as they are able, steps into and takes care of. It's fascinating because I like the way the Amplified renders that passage. It says, if any believing woman or believing man has relatives or person in the household who are widows, let him relieve them. let the church not be burdened with them, so that they may be free to assist those who are truly widows and those who are alone and are dependent. One of the things that I think is really sad today is we find oftentimes that when people become elderly and no longer can care for themselves, that they're put into what we would call nursing homes or things of that nature. I think there's a better term for that. But the simple fact is that they're left to be cared for by full-time professionals. Unfortunately, those positions pay very poorly, and oftentimes the treatment is not the best. There certainly are exceptions, but it's one of those things, if you find yourself looking at that as a future possibility, you really want to start giving some thought as to what kind of facilities and placements are available. But again, what Paul is saying is it's not the church's primary role to take care of people who are in dependent situations or economic hardships, and that essentially there's a certain degree that we can help out, but as far as a long-term solution, it needs to be family. And I wonder today, in this age where I find so many young people are saying they don't want to have children, and some people say it's because they don't want to impact the climate and so forth, which is a bunch of hooey, but also basically they don't want the impediment into their own personal life. They don't want to have the entanglements and the responsibilities. And if you happen to be one of those kind of persons, all I can say to you is that you're going to really rue the day that you didn't have children and grandchildren, because it's stinking lonely as you get older. And one of the things that I often encourage is, if people have elderly friends and family or just acquaintances, that they make the effort to try to include them in their social life as much as is reasonable. And I know that that's taking on a lot, but it's really a godly thing to do. It's really Christ-like to care for these people who often are forgotten. I've used to, years when I had more time and opportunity, I spent a lot of time ministering in retirement homes and assisted living and situations like that, where I just found that so many of those people never have anybody who ever comes by and actually spends time with them and talks to them. And it's kind of sad, because I even know that where my father-in-law lives right now, he lives essentially independently at 100 years of age, which is pretty amazing. But he talks about how many people that live there who never have any family contacts. They don't get any phone calls. They don't get any visitations. Nobody really comes by and takes them out for dinner or breakfast or lunch or a shopping opportunity, and how incredibly sad and lonely that is. And so there's a real opportunity there. I'm always, my wife and I always encourage him to share the faith. In fact, he'll take my CDs that my wife will send to him of my messages, because he's not online. That's way beyond his understanding. But he'll take them, he'll listen to them, and then he'll take them and put them out on the table for anybody that wants them to take them. And he says they disappear almost immediately. And it really tells me that there are people who are desperately anxious to just receive ministry in their life. And I think that's one of those areas that you used to hear a lot about, people going into retirement homes and ministering to the elderly, because you find it's amazing how many of them are not believers, how many of them may have rejected Christianity for most of their life, or have never really even presented with the gospel of grace. What they would do is they were raised in maybe even just a traditional Christian background, where it was all liturgy and ritual, but not something of a personal relationship. And there's a tremendous opportunity. I know one friend of ours, her mother was 105 when one of the caregivers there was a Filipino woman who was a born-again Christian, and she led this 105-year-old woman to Christ. And pretty amazing, because our friend had been seeking to share the gospel for years, and she just had no interest whatsoever. So in many ways, what we're talking about is probably a huge mission field that's being overlooked by a lot of people, because it just isn't something that's connected to our life. We've kind of created a system where we take the elderly and we push them out of sight. And in a lot of countries and states right now, like Canada, Oregon, other places, where they're encouraging these people to get euthanized because, they're too expensive to keep alive. And so they want to push them out of the scene altogether. And I would just simply say to you that If this is something that kind of connects with you and touches your heart, see it as a real ministry, as an opportunity to really share Christ with those people, because many of them, quite frankly, have never had the gospel presented to them in any significant way. Okay, we'll continue tomorrow. One more talking about widows. I warn you in advance. God bless.